you, everyone. Welcome to this event. So my name is Rohan Mukherjee. I am Deputy Director of LSE Ideas. I also teach in the IR department. And it is my great pleasure to have Dr. Shin here, who's a visiting fellow of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute, EUI, and has also had a long and rich career in teaching international relations across the world, in places like Tunisia, Hong Kong, and Colombia, and is now based in the UK. As well as visiting, of course, Florence. And she's published in many peer-reviewed leading journals, such as the Pacific Review, International Relations of the Asia Pacific, and the North Korean Review. And she works on South Korean politics and international relations, North Korean nuclear weapons crises, middle powers, and right-wing populism. So a whole variety of subjects, some of which I think we'll touch on today. And as her discussant and respondent, we have Dr. Boram Lee, who is also teaches in the IR department and works on international trade and social movements in Korea and other places, along with using a range of different methodologies. So I'm very happy to have both these eminent speakers here to talk about today's topic, which is South Korea's democracy at the crossroads, endemic vulnerability or democratic resilience. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Shin, who will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then Dr. Lee will respond, and then we'll have an open Q&A, which I will moderate. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Rohan, for your kind introduction and then invitation. And I'm very pleased to be here today. And just before my talk, just a bit of contextualization. When I was asked by Chris Alden to deliver this talk on South Korea's democracy, I think it was just right after President Yoon Suk Yeol's martial law declaration. It was very topical. However, the talk was rescheduled to today, actually towards the end of more or less March. So then I was naively thinking that by the time probably things are settled, and then probably I would miss the opportunity to talk about this political saga at the height of the crisis. Well, look what happened. South Korea is still in a deep crisis. So I woke up this morning, for example, rushed to check the headlines from South Korea, because this week I expect there will be 3 major important legal decisions will be made for the top 3 leaders in South Korea. Firstly, Prime Minister's impeachment, for example, today, and then opposition party leader Lee Jae-myung's legal case, and presumably, I believe, the President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment sometime this week or next week. So today, what I try to achieve is because the things are still moving, right? So what I try to achieve is to put this political saga into perspective through the prism of right-wing populism, focusing on the politics of anger in South Korea. This is the outline of today's today's talk. I'm going to briefly set out some research questions and objectives, and then introduce the analytical framework and approach that I used and applied for this paper. And lastly, I will discuss the nature of South Korean right-wing populism and its potential electoral impact. On the right, you can see there are 4 pictures. The first 2 show the media coverage about last December. Yoon declared the martial law, causing social, political, and constitutional turmoil in South Korea. Yoon's self-coup immediately faced people's resistance and was quickly overturned by the National Assembly. So the suspended president is now waiting for the constitutional ruling on his impeachment. However, what has developed over the past 3 months is, perhaps surprisingly, the rise of Yoon's supporters. The bottom 2 pictures show this anti-impeachment movement demanding Yoon's immediate release, because they argue Yoon was simply exercising presidential power. The imposition of a martial law was within his power. Therefore, there are no reasons for impeachment. If you happen to be in South Korea and stumbled upon their protest, probably you might feel, may feel confused. Am I in South Korea or in the USA in an American CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference? Because there are the Stop the Steal sign or placards and American flags and MAGA-inspired baseball caps. Yoon's supporters also embrace the unfounded claims that general elections in 2020 and 24, for example, were stolen. These protesters are South Korean MAGA-like, I would like to say. They would argue they are the voice of freedom and freedom of speech, and they are the party who emphasize liberty, freedom, and democracy. Surely it's clear that Yoon's martial law undermined the core values of democratic system. Even some conservatives would agree that. This raises a fundamental questions. Why this Korean MAGA, and why aren't they angry at Yoon? Why are they so determined to support Yoon instead? They are directing their anger at anyone who condemns Yoon's reckless action on December 3rd. So how can we understand their selective anger? So based on this initial observation, I set out these questions. How can we make sense of this selective anger? What are the main drivers feeding this anti-impeachment movement? Can we conclude that South Korea is experiencing or engaged in democratic backsliding? How will this play out in elections? I think in the current debate, I think there is a temptation to characterize this anti-impeachment movement as a, let's say, simply a counterbalance reaction against pro-impeachment movement, often contextualizing this in a confrontational political rivalry between the PPP, the Conservative Party, People Power Party, and the Democratic Party. However, I believe not enough attention has been paid to the nature of this anti-impeachment movement per se. I believe that the social divisions and political polarization have been exacerbated by demagogues and populists. To achieve a more nuanced understanding of this growing anti-impeachment sentiment and its impact on politics, my paper aims to unpack these issues in a more wider framework of populism and examine how this anti-impeachment movement is likely to play out in forthcoming election. A review of the literature, however, doesn't provide a very satisfactory answer for the state of populism in South Korea. It's not straightforward. Mixed and contending views exist. Interestingly, I found two very different assessments. I'm not going into detail, but basically, according to the first approach on your left, populism is on the rise. Here, the term and concept populism is widely used in daily newspapers, by commentators and academic papers or literature, but I think it's very narrowly used as a way of simply denouncing political opponent or discussing the impact of growing popular movement or embracing a new type of means to mobilize people. In contrast, what you can see is that there is a body of literature arguing that there is a general absence of populism or absence of populism in East Asia, especially South Korea and Japan. They argue if you follow very strict sense of, let's say, application of theory and the concept, probably it's very difficult to identify very clear-cut cases in East Asia. And especially they argue monolithic countries like South Korea and Japan, they don't face the social cultural challenges or grievances posed by immigration, like Europe, for example. And also there is a kind of off-the-shelf type of framework to divide the people against the elite in East Asia in terms of class. I think following the Moody's study, I employ an ideational approach. This approach defines populism as a thin-centered ideology, which means inside is hollow, and then populism needs to attach itself to other bigger ideas or other ideologies, such as nationalism, often nativism, and then neoliberalism. The ideational model, this ideational model provides a kind of mental map through which we can examine political reality of populism, helps to identify and define the pure people, and sets out the antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite. And also it shows how populists claim an exclusive representation, asserting that they are the only, let's say, properly represent the pure people. I think this ideational approach is the most broadly used in the field of study today and has advantages for comparative studies. For example, Ole Hallman, in his chapter contribution in the Oxford Handbook of Populism, he argues that populist politicians and parties are an extremely rare species in East Asian democracies, unquote. So looking at key features of ideational approach, I will discuss whether Hallman's argument still holds up. And I will make a counter argument that right-wing populism, mobilizing people's anger, frustration, and then resentment towards the elite, no longer a rare case in South Korea. Let's move on to the right-wing populism in South Korea. Who is behind this South Korean right-wing populism? There are, in fact, fragmented forces. The first, I would like to say, national flag brigade, 태극기 부대, so-called. It is used to be represented by the older generation in their 60s and 70s. They are the generation who experienced Park Chung-hee's developmental state when South Korea was transformed in the 1960s and 70s. They tend to be nostalgic about that time and later came to support Park Chung-hee's daughter, former President Park Geun-hye. This group basically was enlarged during the Park Geun-hye impeachment process in 2016 and 17. In particular, a Christian pastor, Jung Kwang-hoon, played a significant role. Not only successfully mobilized this group, appealing to their emotions, anger and rage over Park's impeachment, but also expanded the movement. Because conservative Christians started joining this protest. Because the size of this group increased, it became a very influential voting bloc, and conservative party leadership could no longer ignore this group. And indeed, they started joining their rallies. The underlying ideology is anti-communism and anti-LGBTQ+, and of course, Christian beliefs. The second group I would like to say is New Right, the so-called New Right. It's represented by so-called technocrats, right-leaning academics, and policymakers. Roughly speaking, they emerged during the Lee Myung-bak government in the mid-2000s. The underlying ideology of this group is neoliberalism. But I would like to say it's a more localized Korean version of New Right, because they are very travel friendly. So it's different from a market-oriented neoliberalism in the strict sense. This group also includes historical revisionists who try to reconceptualize the past, especially rewriting the history of colonial past. For example, there were controversies over the school textbook during the Park Geun-hye presidency and the establishment of the National Day of the Republic of Korea, Konggukjeol. And lastly, there's a relatively new youth right I named, includes the so-called keyboard warriors and the YouTubers in their 20s and 30s. I think for many years they hid away in a dark closet online, but now they are very active in broad daylight. Hate speech, misogynistic, xenophobic language and memes and ideas are widely shared in their online communities. These radical YouTubers are the mostly Yoon's supporters. And then especially anti-feminist voters, particularly in their 20s and early 30s, emerged as a political force supporting Yoon, as well as young conservative politician represented by Lee Jun-suk. What we can see is that during Yoon's presidency, this right-wing populism has significantly strengthened. There was a kind of marriage of convenience. These seemingly different groups have become come to be loosely integrated. They don't have a coherent ideology, but embrace a set of different ideas. This implies that the internal cohesiveness of this group is potentially weak. Having said that, the shared idea holding this group together is anti-communism. So let's move on to the advancement of K-MAGA-like in 2025. The pure people here is conceived through the angle of anti-communism, referring to anti-DPRK, anti-North Korea, but now it's extended to anti-Chinese sentiment, which divides in-group and out-group. Yoon's speeches confirm this decisive notion. This is Yoon's liberation speech delivered in 2023. Here, the in-group is defined as good citizens who support liberal democracy, while the out-group is characterized as anti-state forces following communist totalitarianism. This clearly suggests and demonstrates that what happened on December 3rd was not an aberration. Because these right-wing populists identify themselves strongly with the USA. They emphasize solidarity with Washington. This explains why you can see sometimes American and sometimes Japanese flags in their protest. They would like to assert a united front against North Korea and China. Secondly, in this Korean right-wing populism, the common people are often pitted against so-called Gangnam resident. Gangnam is like a Kensington-like. Gangnam resident corrupt elites. In a similar manner, American right-wing populists do. That is, they're pitting the people, common people, against latte drinking and Volvo driving corrupt elites. Conservatives' anger, frustration, and humiliation grew throughout Park Geun-hye's impeachment and also Lee Myung-bak's imprisonment over corruption, which produced MAGA-style anti-establishment sentiment. That is, the resentment against the opposition party, which they believe put their leaders, presidents, conservative presidents, in prison. Here, Yoon is considered to be the victim of grave injustice at the hands of a corrupt establishment. The Korean MAGA populists would argue that they are the only representatives of the pure people, appealing to their emotion, people's emotion, asserting that the imposition of martial law was inevitable, as I said, to protect the people from anti-state forces. These are pro-China and DPRK sympathizers. Yoon's December 3rd speech, in which he proclaimed martial law, repeated his conviction that anti-state forces needed to be eradicated to defend a free Republic of Korea. In this Korean MAGA-like world, Yoon's narrative claiming that martial law was a just, temporary, and only a warning emergency martial law, this kind of rhetoric and narrative is accepted. Moreover, you can see, again, mirroring of the USA, for example, January 6th, US Capitol attack, his supporters are bought into the deep state and the election fraud conspiracy, and they are easily provoked to political violence, as you can see the last picture on your right. So looking ahead, I want to focus on the political implications of this post-Yoon Suk Yeol era, assuming that he will be impeached. If the motion of impeachment is upheld, then snap election will follow in 60 days. An important question is who will get the PPP candidacy and what role this K-MAGA will play in the conservative primary and election campaign. Han Dong-hoon is one of the contenders because he positioned himself as an in-house opposition against Yoon. It's questionable whether he will be able to appeal to K-MAGA and win the party nomination. Another point is whether a new demagogue or populist figure will emerge in the post-Yoon Suk Yeol era. There are right-wing populist champions in the Conservative Party, for example, Kim Moon-soo and Lee Jun-seok. If they are highly visible in the campaign and elections, probably this would suggest or can be seen as an indication of the extent to which this right-wing populism will prevail in mainstream conservative politics for some time. If Yoon is impeached, there will be a significant momentum for Lee Jae-myung, the opposition party leader who narrowly lost to Yoon in 2022, is currently leading opinion polls. However, it's not clear yet whether he will be able to run again because of political and corruption charges against him. Of course, he all strongly denies. But anyway, if convicted, he could be barred from running. So whomever comes to power next, however, either PPP or DP president, I think they will have to face serious social political challenges. In particular, if the election is decided by tight margin, it is expected that there will be continuing serious political crisis in South Korea. A comfortable victory for Lee Jae-myung, either Lee Jae-myung or other DP candidate or PPP candidate, may provide a breathing space in overly heated domestic politics in South Korea, but it wouldn't necessarily imply right-wing populism is on the wane, disappear soon. And some commentators also concerned about the possibility of Lee, if he's elected, exercising populism from the left. So my take is that populist discourse is likely to remain and stay as a major political consideration with potential to provoke greater social division because the people's anger is deeply rooted. And I believe it's ready to take off whenever the condition is right. So it's all to play for today. And then I'm looking forward to your comments and then questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to start? Or
Yeah.
sit? Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shin. As we just briefly talked before the talk, the situation has been evolving so rapidly, so it's very hard to keep up with what's going on a daily and weekly basis. So just a caveat, I don't study Korean politics, and I'm not a comparative political scientist. I study international relations, but as Dr. Shin, I'm a Korean who's following the news on a hourly basis. So I'll just provide some of my comments based on my very sparse reading of comparative political literature, but also based on what Dr. Shin presented just now. So I think there are some Korean political scientists who actually looked at the public opinion polling data in recent decade. And the polarization and the rise of populism is actually much more nuanced and a little bit complicated at different levels. And now I'm drawing from this recently published study by Yerim Chung and Stephen Haggard, both at UCSD currently. And they just analyzed these public opinion polling data, surveys conducted in South Korea in the last 10 to 15 years. And what they found was, I'll just list these different observations. And the first is the general electorate in Korea, if they do not see themselves as partisan, which means if they do not support a particular party, then those voters' polarization actually hasn't really happened. These people stayed quite moderate in the past 15 years. And then that trend has been very, very stable, at least in South Korea. And also at the elite level, legislators have stayed quite moderate in the past 15 years. If you look at their voting records in various national legislations and bills, they also stayed quite moderate compared to all those people that we just saw in the presentation. So who are these people who became so polarized and so galvanized in the past 4 or 5 years? And actually in their analyses, the voters who identify themselves as partisan or who are party organizers or party activists, those people have become so much polarized in the last 3 or 4 years, especially since 2018. So that trend is really interesting, but also it just gives us this conclusion that what we might be seeing on the news or on the street might not reflect the entire picture or the sentiment at the moderate voter level or even at the legislator level. Although that's not what we see from PPP legislators these days. So the data doesn't cover 2000, this year or the last year, but leading up to the impeachment and the martial law, so there has been these different layers of polarization among the Korean voters and electorates. So then there is this question of polarization over what? And I think I agree with Dr. Shin's presentation and the theoretical framework that this is much driven by this ideology that divides us versus them, us the pure people and the other somebody. So I actually looked at their analysis, Yerim Chung and Stephen Haggard's analysis of this. Is there any polarization on issues or specific issues? And interestingly, on the issue of taxing the top 1% income earners in Korea, there hasn't been a lot of party polarization among right-wing and left-wing voters. There is still some gap, but compared to other policies like gender or the rights of disability rights or LGBTQ issues, the gap between right-wing and left-wing voters are very, very minimal. So that makes me wonder if the polarization that we see right now is actually the pure people versus elites, or is it something else? So it's very interesting. Growing up in South Korea, I think the key difference between the Korean populism that we see right now and the populism that we see in the US or Europe, the narratives or the sentiments seem very different, at least to me. So in the Europe and in the US, at least there are some sentiments that we should take down those top corporate elites who are earning six figures every year without doing so much. So there is that sentiment. But in Korea, it's such a status-driven society where nobody really wants to, I mean, I don't know, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but then I don't see a lot of resentment against people who live in Gangnam or like people who work in like large corporates or like Samsung or Naver or investment banking. So if anything, they just cherish them, like at least from online comment sections. So there's so much polarization among partisan activists and partisan voters, but then it's very hard to pin down why they are so angry and what they are angry at. And I think that goes back to Dr. Shin's the framework or argument about this marriage of convenience or this hybrid coalition of right-wing voters or party organizers. And I think that coalition is really interesting. As Dr. Shin said, there is this one group of older like right-wing voters or right-wing supporters who are very much nostalgic about this authoritarian era. But there is this another group in this coalition, which is characterized by Lee Jun-suk or like the men in their 20s, who are very much against the rise of feminism or other like gender-related issues. So I think it's much more than just anti-communism or anti-something. I don't actually think they can talk to each other if they were put in the same room. But then they are just against something that we are not yet sure what that is. But then one observation in that Chung and Haggard paper, which I just read for this presentation, one thing that was really interesting in their finding is that, so in one of the surveys, the survey conductors asked this question to their respondents. And the question is, would you support your child if they were going to marry somebody who is a Democrat or who is a conservative? And that is your, like, the other party that compared to like your own party. And then that anti-conservative or anti-progressive sentiment has risen over time, like among those party activists or partisan voters. But then one thing that's interesting about the conservative right-wing voters is that they also don't like their own co-partisans as well. So if you're a conservative voter and if you're a proactive partisan conservative in South Korea, they also don't like their own co-partisans, like other PPP supporters, but they just hate progressive Minjudang supporters so much that they would just like take to the street and like protest against Lee Jae-myung or Jo-guk or any other progressive politicians. So this marriage of convenience or hybrid coalition framework, I think, is right on. And then it just needs more exploration in why they are aligned with each other for what. And when would that unstable coalition collapse? Because it's not a coalition for a policy objective. It's a coalition against your own common enemy. And in that sense, I have two quick comments. And so in that sense, I'm very curious to see how this current political landscape will affect the electoral outcome. If those survey data are correct, then if we still have this very robust moderate voters in South Korea, maybe what we will see in the electoral outcome or at the ballot might not be as polarized as we might actually expect. Of course, yeah, that's a very risky bet, but I will bet that it'll be a landslide for the progressive candidate this time. And my second just brief comment is about this Korean MAGA framing, which is actually, I think, very, very right on as well. And actually, Rohan, Professor Mukherjee and I attended a talk about LGBTQ movement in Europe. But what the speaker, Philip Ayub from UCL, he was talking about how those conservative movements are learning so quickly from progressive movements like pro-LGBTQ movements, like in terms of tactics and organization skill sets. And what we are seeing here is very similar to what he described in his talk at LSEIR today. And what's really striking is that in 2016 was the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. Was it 16 or 17? Yeah, 17. So in 2017, there was not this much movement or organization on the part of like pro-Park Geun-hye movement or supporters. But then now the pickets that we see, like Stop the Steal, or their tactic, like just carrying the American flag, is not new. But then the level of organization on that front, the conservative front, is very, very different. It's on a new level. And in my own research, I study LGBT movement in South Korea. But then one thing that's really interesting is that even before this impeachment of Yoon Suk Yeol and martial law event, Korean churches have been learning a lot or liaising with American churches to fight against the LGBT rights in Korea. So there is that like movement level connection between Korean and US conservative groups. And then now what we see on the street is kind of a culmination of those cross-country transnational activist networks, but this time this is just conservative movements. So I think all those things were marinated in the presentation today. And then I just look forward to hearing your comments and then interact with the speaker.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, before we start questions, I'll start with one question and then we can open it up to the audience. Right? So I mean, this idea of emulation, right? They're copying some of the tactics of MAGA, right? You called it K-MAGA and so on. But then you also talked about churches learning, all of that. Is there more to it? Are there more substantial relationships of say, funding and strategizing? Because something that I'm looking at is sort of right-wing populism networking more broadly, where there are these, moments where there are international conferences where right-wing parties from different countries come together. So a country that I study, India, the BJP ruling party sent its representatives to the National Conservatism Conference in DC in August or July 2024. And the representative from the BJP stood up and said, we believe in the same things that you believe in, God, family, and country, right? And there's this kind of solidarity and ideological networking that's happening. And there's also funding, right? There's a lot of funding that's passing international borders, right? So is there evidence of that in Korea, or is it more just sort of long distance emulation and learning? What's the mechanism here? If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, that's very interesting point because I think there's a speculation about the connection between Korean MAGA-like groups, basically led by big evangelical churches, not only evangelical churches, I think Baptist churches and the other denomination of Christian churches, and then even big Presbyterian churches now behind of this K-MAGA movement. Also, some people speculated that the CPAC, the American Conservative Activist Movement, there's connection between this Korean MAGA-like people and big churches and then the conservative, let's say fundamental evangelical churches in the USA. Well, I think we have to see, actually, someone needs to do maybe investigative journalists to try to really pin down this financial flow of this movement. But I think some, as far as I know, some people try to look at the connections, but I'm not sure whether they can really grab the substantive evidence.
Yeah, totally. I don't know any concrete evidence of fundings or financial flows. It's more like this ideational influence.
Okay, great. Questions? Please raise your hand and I'll just get, okay, please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your presentation today. My name is Sung Kim. I'm a master's student majoring in public policy and administration in LSE. I have a question about your present, actually. My question is, according to the National Barometer Survey, MBS, on March 20th, 60% of people said that we should impeach the president, but 35% of the people said that the Constitutional Court should turn down the impeachment against the president. So this survey means that I think even though many people watch it, the president violated the Constitution by declaring the martial law through the YouTube. They can see. They can also do like fact checking against a lot of fake news regarding corruption in elections. However, more than 3 out of 10 people are against the impeachment. We can see like the survey results these days. So, and now they are threatening the democratic and judiciary system in South Korea, in my opinion. So my question is, how can you change the extremist thoughts or opinions who support like President Yoon or K-MAGAism you said? So although this impeachment case is much more clear case than the previous impeachment case against the President Park, polarization is extremely strong, and it is now a serious issue in the current society, I think. So how can you resolve this issue? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Maybe it's $1 million question.
Would you like to?
Okay,
Yeah.
can we collect some?
You want to collect some? Okay, sure. Any, yeah, please go ahead. If you can introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for your bright presentation. I'm Aldo Cisneros. I'm from Peru. I'm a student in development management here at the LSE. And my question is the following. President Yoon was facing already decreasing rates of approval, and this move of declaring martial law was seen as a desperate move. So someone could think that will be the end of polarization of right-wing activism in South Korea. Nevertheless, we are seeing a really a worrying tendency towards young men in South Korea. That is, they are leaning towards the far right. Many polls are showing that each year more and more young men in South Korea are leaning towards these conservative values, while women engage in progressive values with the 4B movement. So this polarization that is now on the gender axis could like fit again and give like a second life to this far right movement, just as it happened in the US. For example, Trump won in great degree because young men supporting him because wanted a white man instead of a racialized woman as a president.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Just to add some context, I mean, there was a Financial Times survey last year or a year before. It's not just Korea, right? Across advanced democracies, there's a very clear divide growing between men and women, young men and young women. Young men are becoming more conservative and young women are becoming more liberal. And one of my questions actually, which I was holding for later, but I'll ask it now, which is, all these figures are men, right? Is this an endemic feature of Korean politics? Perhaps it is, or but is it, you know, something that's even worse in the K-MAGA movement, right? That it's men who are represented and also drawn to this. Did you want to collect more, or do you want to?
No, I just.
Yeah.
I think the 35% probably they are not all MAGA-like people, right? So probably you can easily imagine that you are anyway conservative supporters and voters, no matter what happened. So I can see roughly about these days at 30%. So when Yoon Suk Yeol started his presidency, his approval rating started from around 35%. The second year down to around 30%. And after the impeachment, probably was also a little bit lower than 30%, I believe. So the core supporters now about, I think, about 25%. But having said that, probably there are still, South Korea is quite conservative society, and then especially older voters still strongly support the conservative PPP party. Having said that, as I said, probably amongst those 30 and 35% of population, probably roughly speaking, about 50% is very, very, I don't know, how can I say, very far right, or some of the moderate conservatives turn to also far right. That's the, I think, trend. what I have seen over the last couple of years. So this various different groups of right-wing movement, probably they started, especially these 태극기 부대, they started really low-key, let's say humble start. They're operating on the margins of conservative politics. But throughout this Bakuner's impeachment and then Lee Myung-bak's imprisonment, I think they can kind of momentum, they kind of move into the mainstream conservative politics. And then, and one of the, my observations, quite a little bit worrisome. Last month I briefly went back and then interviewed a number of people, including my former colleagues in Seoul. So there are former colleagues in Sejong Institute and then Ewha universities. There are academics that have PhDs. And then I found it a bit difficult to actually continue to engage in a conversation. They tend to see things from different perspectives. And then they even embrace this political violence. They tend to think that it's inevitable to save so-called the Republic of Korea. So how can we that's a very difficult question, but what I can see, this Yoon's martial law certainly revealed some institutional weakness of South Korean system. This institutional weakness, probably we can work on it and then, for example, revise the constitution and then the strengthening oversight of this excessive power by the executive office. We can do all these institutional and systemic measures. We can provide and revise, and we can work on it. But I think one of the biggest problems is this Yoon's martial law kind of breaches this informal democratic norm, I would like to say, because there's kind of, we cannot set out every single thing to what the president can do or cannot do. There's kind of agreed understanding and consensus. You shouldn't cross this line, but he did. And then how can we build and reestablish so-called social trust and then mutual tolerance? Probably one of the ways to reestablish this, probably we need to take a long-term perspective, and probably we can also try to invest in the civic education about the values of democratic system. Yeah? That's my take. And then, I mean, the gender divide, it's one of the things, I started this South Korean right-wing population research, actually when I'm looking at the, and I try to examine the gender divides, so-called, in young voters, especially looking at 2022 presidential election. Is it 2022? Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I thought that, after my initial observation and examination, I thought that it was a little bit of exaggeration, this gender divide, because this gender divide is somehow, I think, more exaggerated and exacerbated by populists like Lee Yoon Suk. What these populists, what they're good at is they politicize and repoliticize some of the issues that previously wasn't an issue. And then, so if you look at the 2022 voter turnout, actually, of course, we can see significant voter demise between young voters. So young females voted for the opposition, well, Lee Jae-myung, then is a ruling party candidate. And then the young males voted for, clearly, about 60%, voted for Yoon Suk Yeol. But not many people talk about is their vote, the voter turnout of this young group in 20s and early 30s was very low. The impact of this populist movement and populist propaganda is discouraging people to go to the polling station because this political cynicism. What we can see was in the 2022 voter turnout in different age groups is a serious gap between the older voters over 60s and the rest 40s and 30s and 20s or younger voters. Huge big gap, and which is the trend that what I think it was kind of yeah. I mean that was the problem. I think that's I think we need to more look at. I believe, and I think this younger voters gender divide is still moving, and then. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I want to believe that these younger voters, their voter behavior is quite still fluid. And then, yeah, I think.
Would you like to add any?
Yeah, the question is, it's a very difficult question to answer. But then one research that I thought of, I forgot the name of the author, but she's a PhD student at Duke University, and she's a Korean or Korean American researcher. She studies why people become so much, get into this political extremism. And one answer she provides is loneliness. And in her data of American public, actually, during COVID, and a lot of people got isolated, and politics became one outlet for them to actually connect with other people. So I think I thought that was very much applicable to the Korean society during the COVID, and I actually listened to a lot of YouTube during the lockdown in the US. So I think, especially Korean society is aging so quickly, and a lot of elderly, they don't have jobs, they don't have a community where they can talk about their daily lives. And so I think that might be where we might want to look at. And the gender gap is really important and frustrating question. And I also don't, I mean, it's young voters, I think the story there is quite different from like the older voters that we are talking about. I'm just very impressed at Korean women and like non-binary voters. And when I went to the protests in support of the impeachment in Korea in December, I counted, I don't know their gender, but I tried to count the ratio of like men versus women in this binary scheme, and like 9 women to 1 man was what I saw at the protests in Yeouido. And I think in this sense, I'm just also very frustrated with Korean progressive parties like Minjudang, like in a sense that they don't really reflect those women's agenda and other like queer agenda in their platform. And I understand that it's very difficult to incorporate those agendas in this like majoritarian like presidential system, competing to get the median voter support. But then again, women have been showing up for them like in the past 10 or not like 50 years actually. And then still, like if you go to the protest scenes in Korea, you see a lot of like pride flags. And then no mainstream politicians in Korean National Assembly is brave enough to talk about the legislation of like marriage among like same-sex marriage and stuff. So I wonder if that momentum in support of progressive agenda and the rule of law, how long can it sustain without the support of women and queer and other like progressive supporters whose voices are not reflected in the actual mainstream agenda. So we'll see. But then I think I agree with Dr. Shin that without some major change in the political institutions, such as electoral system, like we have a very much winners take all kind of electoral system. Without changing them, politicians' incentives may not change.
Great, thanks so much. Any more questions? Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you so much for the nice lecture. I'm a master's student here at LSE. I'm currently in a dual degree program between PKU and LSE and international affairs. So I have a couple of questions, and my first question is to you, Professor. And you mentioned that far-right politicians in Korea are mobilizing anger, and then they're utilizing this anger to their own political advantage. My question is that where is this anger coming from? Like, what is the root source of this anger, and how does it connect to far-right agendas such as anti-communism or being anti-China or anti-DPRK? Because you see far-right in the West, they're angry at immigrants, and they believe that immigrants are taking away their jobs or their welfare or whatever. But in Korea, that's not the case, is it? Chinese are not taking away Korean jobs. North Koreans are not taking away Korean jobs. They have nothing to do with regular people. How does that anger connect to the way you just mentioned?
Great. Did you want to collect or?
No, I'm going to just quickly answer to this question. Thank you. It's a very good question. The anger, I believe, it's deeply rooted in, deprivation in terms of social, economic, and political. As I identified in this lecture or whatever seminar, I identified three far-right or right-wing populist groups. So they have different agendas and different issues. South Korean populism is different from the populism in Europe and USA, I believe. It's pretty much focusing on not nativism or anti-immigration, but as I said, it's anti-communism. From their point of view, they share this view that, believe it or not, they believe that Chinese bought everything. So there's a serious infiltration by China in South Korea. So some of the people whom I interviewed saying that majority of Democratic Party MPs are bought by Chinese money, and even some of the Conservative Party members are Chinese spy. That's the they think. So this anti-communism is consumed quite differently amongst these three groups. So first, what I said, the Taegukib there, is they see things through more or less ideological lens, the anti-Chinese lens. But this second group, probably they tend to see more vis-a-vis this the U.S. relationship, because the USA foreign policy against, let's say, anti-China influenced South Korean new right and those technocrats' view towards China. So it's a slightly different angle they consume this anti-communism. Having said that, this youth right, for them it's more like more come to, let's say, it's a culture war. It's anti-Chinese sentiment between Korea and China. So the way that the South Korean population war, or underpinned, let's say, underpinned by this nationalism, but it's not pan-Korean nationalism, but I think it's more exclusive Korean, but here South Korean, the Republic of Korean nationalism, not underpinned by the anti-immigration, but it's underpinned by anti-communism. That's what I would say.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. In regard to,
Let's actually, Ron, did you want to respond to that question? Okay, yeah.
this is kind of an IR question, so I think this is also related compared to policy question. So
Could
a
you
lot
speak
of
up so that folks in the background hear
So
you?
a lot of conservative leaders in Korea today, whether they're radical or not, are now beginning to advocate for nuclearization of South Korea. and then they point to, I think this is like Amendment 10. Is this like 10th Amendment in the NPT? Is this also another form of right-wing populism, or does this actually make sense? Because Korea tried a lot with North Korea, but unfortunately, I think a lot of those efforts and policymaking have failed so far, and therefore they're looking at ways to secure Korea with some, I guess, radical way. Do you see this as a right-wing populism, or since you're an IR scholar, does this make sense somehow?
No, like,
So from,
you studied law.
You're both IR scholars.
You studied
We're all IR
politics.
scholars. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, so let's put it this way. I think you have to understand, if you look at South Korean polls, and then overall, the public started supporting the idea of South Korea go nuclear. It's quite natural because even now, the DPRK, our enemy number one, is advancing their nuclear capability. So from South Korea's perspective, and especially now we have Trump 2.0, we saw what happened in Washington, D.C., the Zelensky. It's not really far from home. I mean, this could be our future. And that there's a growing, I think, growing anxiety overall. We should consider seriously the option of going nuclear. That's the kind of sentiment. Having said that, this idea of going nuclear actually started, roughly speaking, early 2000s, and just only a handful of Conservative Party members started talking about, oh, we should consider. But it was just a handful. Now, quite a lot. That's kind of worrisome indication. And also, it's not only Conservative Party, because now the Democratic Party, some of the members also speculating quite openly, if we cannot go nuclear, probably we should consider, why don't we complete this nuclear cycle? Then we can be a proper nuclear capable country. I think it's quite dangerous. I think, I can understand, because there is a growing concern in the public, and then politicians should be responsive to these growing concerns. Having said that, you have to really, really take into consideration many things, such as probably many of you follow the South Korean newspapers. And South Korea was designated as a sensitive and what is the term? Sensitive country by the Ministry of Energy in the USA recently. Apparently, which is related to South Korea's discourse, nuclear discourse, and sending clear message to South Korea. Well, hang on a minute. You should think again. This is not possible. In order to complete, so there are a number of issues, technical issues. In order to complete this nuclear cycle, South Korea needs to revise the nuclear agreement with the USA. I don't think that even Trump would consider to revise this agreement. Who knows? We don't know whether we cannot really predict what's like. That's one of I'm going to make it clear. And then a second thing, probably also we are going to face lots of sanctions, not from only USA, but also EU, and also China. China would like South Korea to have nuclear weapons. And this is my take, but I think now currently the Democratic Party, I think, slightly changed the tone and the rhetoric of this South Korea going nuclear. So they kind of step back. But, well, we have to wait and see some space.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, just one quick thing. If you put yourselves in the shoes of like a Democratic or conservative legislator, this is such a great opportunity for you to distract the public from what's going on with President Yoon Suk Yeol. And like, oh, we should talk about like nuclearization and self-defense. And then it's just such an opportune time because the U.S. Trump's national security guarantee is weakening, as Dr. Shin said. So yeah.
If I could abuse my privilege as chair, we have someone in the audience who has actually authored a paper recently on the desire for nuclear proliferation.
Oh yeah.
Woo Yuk Seo is a PhD student in our department. I wonder if you want to add anything to this discussion?
Nothing to add, to be honest. I'm sorry.
Nothing.
I'll jump in later. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was tweeting. He was not listening. No, I'm joking. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Han Lee. I'm currently a third year undergraduate studying international relations and history. Thank you so much for your talk. And the question I have is, well, about the three different groups of K-MAGA supporters of you that you have just classified in your talk. And I was wondering if we are talking about the pure people versus the anti-state threatening people into like those binary scheme, are the pure people, like those people who believe that they are like part of the pure people, I mean, are they stimulated by this framing of being called as pure people, oh, we are like pro-state, or do they think, like practically and strategically think that their life will be better under Yoon? I was wondering because based on your classification of three different groups of K-MAGA supporters, I mean, sure, the Taekwondo are like very old people and they have gone through the historic nostalgia of the Park Chung-hee era. But for the youth right or young right, those are like 20s and 30s who didn't even go through the Park Chung-hee's developmental state model. So I was just wondering, is this like purely emotional, even for the supporters side, like not for the populist politicians side, but even for the like supporter side? Like, are they being driven by emotion, or are they driven by something else, like their expectation that their like socioeconomic status or something else could be much better by strategically supporting you?
About that? Did you have a question?
Yes. I'm studying behavior science and LSE as a postgraduate, and my name.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit for everyone? Yeah.
Hello, I'm studying behavior science at LSE as a postgraduate, and I'm Mingyong Kim. Thanks for your presentation first. And going back to anti-communism again. My question is more related to the geopolitics of South Korea. So these days I see when I saw the article of the martial law, self-defense or or security reason for doing that look very superficial and shallow, outdated propaganda. And then these days I see some new opinion leaders arguing that they discovered that more greater depth of Chinese involvement in politics, moving the younger generation or younger voters towards anti-impeachment movement. So I think, as she said, they didn't experience kind of historic nostalgia of the dictatorship and stuff. So then why did it happen? Why did it work? Although the target population is different, what was the mechanism behind? That would be my question.
Perfect, great questions. Would you like to answer these two, both of you, and then take more? Or?
Well, I think two questions are related, right?
Yeah.
I identify youth right, they're quite different from the other two groups. And then, as I briefly mentioned, how they consume this anti-communist idea is not like the other two. They pretty much see is identity politics. It's a culture war between China and South Korea. This anti-Chinese sentiment, it's how can I say it? This anti-Chinese sentiment is somehow, it's difficult to describe. It's like anything or something to do with or related to China. It's kind of dirty mark on someone, right? It's a stigmatized some people, some politicians, even high-profile officials are. Even these days, you have a Chinese title, Chinese sound like a name. This is a serious negative remark on these people. It's identity politics. It's kind of anti-Chinese sentiment. So the way this young generation consume this, according to Yoon, it's anti-state forces, but I think it's slightly different how they approach and how they consume this communist, anti-communist thing. But having said that, probably some of these youth rights groups, of course, it's self-serving, some of the groups, especially YouTubers, they're making really serious money from this live broadcasting, and then also anti-Chinese, anti-TPRK propaganda, at the same time supporting Yoon. So there's a self-interest, of course. But also, I think we need to also take into consideration of the impact of these mega big Christian churches. These church members are drawing into this type of movement as well. I think in that sense, I think there's kind of similarities. American MAGA and even Brazil, what's happening now, and South Korea, there are pretty much similarities. The role played by these big Christian churches, evangelical churches.
Yeah, so just to, I'm very hesitant to say this without looking at the data or not being an expert in this topic. But then I think a lot of young men in South Korea might be feeling like they're not getting as much as their older men or older generation males used to. And then I think that kind of probably led to some frustrations. But again, very much speculative, so I'll shut up here.
There's also a large literature on the status threat that established groups feel when previously marginalized groups start to do better. So if women are improving their position in society.
Yeah, so that's why I said, I briefly mentioned the deprivation, because a young male's point of view, I mean, compared to their father and grandfather's generation, they think that they are deprived by this, social prejudice, privileges. At the same time, they face competition from female peers.
There was a question back there. Yeah, please. And also, sorry, I'm being very negligent on this side. Is anyone here as well? If you raise your hand. Or no? Okay. One there and one there. We'll just take three together. Yeah. First you, then you, and then.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Taeha. I study development management at LSE with Aldo. My question is, given the protest formation in Seoul, the lefties are showing more solid bond each other, I think, LGBTQ plus feminists, metal labor union and
Could
farmers.
you speak up a little bit?
Sorry, you don't have to raise your voice a little bit.
Okay.
Given the protest formation in Seoul these days, I think the lefties are showing more solid bonds each other. For example, LGBTQ plus, feminists, metal labor union and farmers, they are united together, while the far right is not, as you mentioned, measure of convenience. But personally, I think there already is a social consensus for impeachment, like such as like 1 million people gathered last weekend in Seoul and they were protesting, but it seems like it'll be so difficult to get rid of the far right in South Korea, especially considering the dismissed impeachment of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo last night. But as Lee Jae-myung once said, like PPP should be removed and the Democratic Party should serve as a conservative party in South Korea. And I think the Democratic Party is not also a proper representative of the lefties in South Korea. So I want to hear your outlook on the future political paradigm of South Korea as a voter and civilian of South Korea.
Great, thank you. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, I'm doing master's degrees in political communication, and I'd like to ask a very short question. After martial law, in many Korean politicians discuss about the current presidential system should be replaced by a parliamentary cabinet system. Do you think it could be a solution about the political system reform can be a solution about this current Korean situation, very extreme polarization?
Thank you. And over there.
Hi, my name is Philip. I was a student here at the LSE a long time ago. I now work for Mirai Asset. I think sort of we are definitely, I can see that we're seeing symptoms of anxiety, not just here, but here in the UK, I think in the US as well. I think there are kind of mismatches in terms of realities and expectations, both from the younger generation. I think there are issues with older generations who are trying to come to terms with a world that's just changing very, very quickly. I think, can I draw you back to the considerations about the demographic problem that Korea faces, huge pension liability issue that you're facing, and also a series of pretty tough decisions that Korea is going to face between which economic bloc they want to be closer to, which is perhaps also at the heart of this. And I'd like you to answer whether you feel Korea needs a strong leader to make decisions like this, just as the US people have chosen, well, for better or worse, a strong leader who's willing to make tough decisions, and whether this is what Korea needs right now, because it's possible that you're going to face some extremely tough questions in the next 5 to 10 years with regards to everything I've said before, as well as growing unemployment and discontent.
Okay, so question about who represents the left in Korean politics, whether it should be a parliamentary system, does Korea need a strong leader to solve its demographic crisis, and which economic bloc to choose. We have 4 minutes for you to answer all those questions.
Okay, just let me very quick. I think currently the Democratic Party, for their electoral campaign as a strategy, try to emphasize they're moving into kind of center-right, that direction. But in my honest opinion, they already moved. I think there was kind of convergence between kind of center-right and center-left convergence in South Korean politics, so PPP and then DP. Sometimes you cannot see really significantly different policies. So somehow they're kind of converged. Therefore, I think there was a room created on the far right, at the same time far left. That's why I briefly hinted during my talk. There are some concerns, some commentators. Probably Lee Jae-myung is going to be lefty populist leader. There's a kind of, so yeah, I think, Democratic Party is not really progressive party at all, in my honest opinion. So it shouldn't be called progressive party. We need to be careful when we identify the party, but anyway. Constitutional reform, yeah, they've been, I mean, this is a kind of debate over the last couple of decades, actually. Decades, yeah. But I think still the public prefer to have a presidential system. They want to choose their own leader. In that sense, probably, you know, the politicians wouldn't be able to really strongly push forward this idea of shifting towards the parliament system. But having said that, if we're going through this constitutional reform, it's likely that 4-year, 2-term system instead of 5-year system. But to some degree, probably we are going to strengthen the some of the measures to oversight or the presidential power. That's the kind of outcome that I believe. And what was the last question?
Strong leader.
Strong leader. I mean, Lee Jae-myung, for example, probably he can be seen as a new strong leader vis-a-vis or compared to Moon Jae-in. But again, strong leader, yes, but is it left version of Yoon Suk Yeol? There is a, I mean, serious, I think, challenges here. We need a strong leader with vision, and going through these difficult times, not only domestically, I mean internationally too, but again, the leader should be bounded by the rule of law and then democratic law, I believe. Yes, we need a strong leader, but they're big but.
Last word.
Really quick 3 sentences. I don't think there will be the emergence of a big left progressive party without changing the electoral institution that we have. And the second, parliamentary cabinet system. I think a lot of comparative scholars actually thought that a crisis like this would lead to an institutional reform, like the one that you mentioned. But I'm just very interested to observe how the reform is actually very difficult to combine, even with a crisis like this. But I'm very skeptical about the actual feasibility of the reform right now. And the third, strong leader, I don't think we need a strong leader. I think we need a leader who can make a broader coalition to make important decision that determines the fate of the country.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very